Welcome back. And we're going to talk now for a little bit about deacons. Deacons are an important part of your ministry. In the New Testament, there are only two offices of the local church that are mentioned. If we take the office of pastor, the poimen, presbyteros, the elder, and the bishop, the episkopos, is the same thing, and I do. Then the other office is the office of deacon. You know how, the office of deacon originates in the book of Acts. And the need, a lot of times people say the purpose of the office of deacon is to serve. I disagree with that. The office of deacon originated to preserve the unity of the church. Serving was secondary. It was important, but it wasn't the main reason. They didn't need the deacons simply because widows needed to be served. They needed them because the unity was threatened. There were two groups. One group felt slighted, and so the apostles said, well, it's not right that we should leave the ministry of the word and prayer and serve tables. So appoint among yourselves these 7 men that are honest and of good reputation and filled with the Holy Spirit, and let them do it. So they served, but anybody could have served. What they really needed was the unity of the church preserved. Excuse me. So you really need to teach that. You need to drill that into the minds of your deacons, that that's their main job. You need to also be clear that when you say preserve the unity, you do not mean merely agree with you. If they read you saying preserve unity as agree with me, they're just not going to respect you as much. They're not going to feel important. So you need to make it clear that they have your permission to disagree with you, but they just can't do it in a way that creates discord. That means you have to be open to them pushing back and disagreeing with you and seeing things in a different way. Remember, again, you always reproduce what you honor. And when they disagree with you, you need to call attention to it. You need to say, now look, you see the way he did that? I appreciate so much the way he expressed that disagreement. And that gives them that necessary permission so they don't feel like they're disloyal to you if they disagree. But it also encourages them, make sure you do it in the right way. Think about the unity of the church while you are disagreeing and the way you express it. So you're going to, if you're called to a church, unless you're a church planter, you're going to inherit deacons. If you plant a church, you're probably going to have something to do with who you get. But the reality is, most of the time, you're going to inherit deacons. And when you go to a church, even in your discussion with committee, you need to find out, is the church on a rotation basis, or are they deacons for life? Now, you can live with either one, and neither one is like more biblical than the other. Bible doesn't say, but certainly I think there's wisdom in both things. I've had both things. I probably lean to a rotation system as being healthier. It just keeps a power base from building up. And if you do happen to have some deacons serve that aren't in such, they're not great deacons, you only have to live with them for 3 years. But you may not get to say anything about that. You might have to live with what you get when you inherit a fellowship of deacons. By the way, notice, I've said this at Buck Run for 15 years and it still hadn't caught on. I never say deacon body. Everybody at Buck Run says deacon body. I never say it. because the deacons aren't a body. The church is a body. They're a fellowship within the body. So I always say deacon fellowship, and I never say deacon body, but everybody else at Buck Run says deacon body. So uh, I like to be a little bit more precise about it, and it's the deacon fellowship within the body. So if you inherit deacons that are deacons for life, if they're good deacons, that's a great thing. You don't have to worry about getting bad ones. If, on the other hand, you get bad deacons and they're in there for life, it can cause you some problems, some real difficulties. So, how do you handle it? Well, let me tell you my story. At Ashland Avenue, I inherited deacons for life. Now, remember, I knew them. I've been on staff from 80 to 87, left and went to seminary from 87 to 90, came back as pastor in 1990. It was a great congregation, older deacons. I'm guessing the average age of the deacons at that time would have been about 70. Because there was a couple of 90-year-olds on there. And Ashland Avenue at that point had only had two pastors before me, founded in 1916. Ross Range was there from 16 to 66. And Clarence Walker, 16 to 66. Ross Range from 66 till 1990. I was only the third pastor in that church's history. So some of those deacons went all the way back to the Clarence Walker years. And deacons had really served not as deacons, but as a super committee. They made the decisions. My first deacons meeting as pastor, we spent an hour and a half or 2 hours discussing one matter of business, and it was whether or not the staff could spend $100 to buy a microwave for the break room. And I sat there going, "Oh my goodness, this is awful." Contrast that. That was me I was 30, right? My first deacons meeting at Buck Run, which that would have been 2003, so I was 43 then. One of the deacons brought up we had not one but two youth pastors at the time that had been hired between Bob's departure and my coming, which was not a good move. But the deacons brought up a concern about them, and I said, "That's a management issue. Just let me take care of that." End of discussion. There's a difference in me at 30 and me at 43, knowing how to handle that. So me at 30 listened to that for an hour and a half or 2 hours and was just dying. How am I going to deal with this? There were several things that happened the first couple of months that I saw I was in a mess. And here's what I've learned about pastoring. Most of the stuff you face, there's something you feel like you need to do in order to deal with it. The real thing you need to do is almost always the opposite direction of what you think you need to do. I think pastoring is inherently counterintuitive. So when you think you should be pushing, you really, most of the time, should be stepping back and applying no pressure whatsoever. And a lot of times when you think you don't really need to be engaged in stuff is when you really need to be pushing the hardest. So everything in me wanted to push these guys hard and say, "You're not doing your job. We need to have a deacon rotation system," all that. I sensed them wanting control. And to a large extent, they had control. Everything in me wanted to push back. But just praying and seeking the Lord about it, I did the counterintuitive thing. And that was, instead of taking ministry away from them, I came in and I heaped it on. So here was my plan. I came in, and I had a big stack of papers for each of them, and I said, I need you to forgive me because I have not been using you in the way that you need to be used. And I said, the Lord just convicted me of that. So I think you guys are fully capable of ministry, coming along beside me. And so I have gone through our membership roles, and I've assigned each of you about 15 families. I'm going to ask each of you to visit each one of these families at least 3 times during the year. And just to those that are in church, just make sure they're okay. Those that are not coming, why aren't they coming? What can we do to reach them? And I went through a whole list of things like that that I wanted them to do. I mean, I said, we're going to divide this up in the deacon family ministry. And then furthermore, I think every one of you, all deacons need to know how to need to know how to share their faith. And so we've got evangelism explosion we're implementing in our church. And I'm going to ask each one of you to go through EE within the next 2 years so you know how to share your faith. And we're going to have a deacon visitation program where we're out witnessing it. Man, I just piled it on. They sat there listening to me tell them what all they were going to do with this wide-eyed look on their faces. Like, man, that's a lot of work. And they were silent. They just weren't saying anything. So I got through about a 30-minute spiel there. I said, anybody, any questions? I mean, it was silent. And they debated, an hour and a half on a microwave oven a couple of months before. But when I told them what I needed them to do, they just got real quiet. I said, well, I know it's a lot for you to chew on. We'll talk more about it next month. Here, I want you to take this that I've prepared. I've already made family assignments to each of you. Here you go. It was just quiet. I walked out. The next day, my phone rang off the hook. And the conversation in every case went like this. Hey, Pastor, that plan you gave us last night, that's fantastic. That needs to happen. But I'm just too old to do that. So I think it's best for me to resign as a deacon. And I think you probably need to get some younger men to help with that. I would say, man, thank you, brother. I appreciate so much that you take it seriously. And I'm going to ask the church to make you deacon emeritus. We want to honor you for all the years of service you've given. And I will. I'll take that to the church that we need to elect a new deacon in your place. And that day, over half my deacons resigned. And none of them mad, none of them upset. And so I went to the church and I told them what had happened. And I said, we need to elect new deacons. And in fact, I think we need to expand it. I think we had 20 and I wanted to enlarge it to 30. So basically, I was able, and then I led the church in exactly how to choose deacons. We talked about the spiritual qualifications of a deacon. I preached on it. We printed it up. We went into a time of prayer, asking people to go into prayer to just seek the Lord and who should be a deacon. I look back on it. I think, again, it's hard to know. I was 30 years old. I was coming into a sort of a difficult situation. But I look at it now, I think I should have also asked them to go to a rotation system at the same time. Maybe that would have been too much. I don't know, but I think when we elected that many, that if I'd said, look, I'm going to ask these guys to work so hard, they're going to need a year off after 3, so let's go to a rotation schedule. I think we could have pulled it off, but I didn't do it. Probably should have. But anyway, we ended up electing, like 20 new deacons. They came in. We elected a couple of single men. They just had fresh eyes and young blood, and they were willing to do all that stuff. And I had a marvelous group of deacons at Ashland Avenue, and it was with those group of deacons that we went through. You know, the church voted to relocate and bought property, and they were just phenomenal. And I did get the church to pass a bylaw that all deacons, upon their election into the office of deacon, had to take evangelism explosion within 2 years. That is, they had to learn how to share their faith. I don't know how many people I baptized that deacons had led to Christ. So everything in me wanted to push against those guys, but you know, you feel like, man, they want control. They want to take all this ministry. Your instinct is to take it away. I'm telling you, the right thing to do is to pile it on, because no one could get mad at me for giving them too much ministry. I mean, when have you ever heard of that? But you get into a tug of war with your deacons, and you're on one side and they're on the other. I can tell you, the math doesn't add up in your favor. You're probably not going to win that. But when you do the counterintuitive thing and pile it on them, the serious ones stick, and those that aren't, you know, they don't really. They just want to vote on whether or not you can spend $100. They're not going to stick. So share ministry with your deacons. Now at Buck Run, we have a deacon rotation system. We've had 30 deacons, and so every year we elected 10. 10 rotate off. We elect another 10 for a 3-year term. So every year, 10 rotate off, 10 are elected for a 3-year term. Our needs have grown. This year, we elected 13. So I'm right on that, all right? So we're going to a total of 39. I can never remember if it's 39 or 42. I always get confused. But so we're expanding the number of deacons. And again, man, our deacons are incredible. Two things you need to think about together. One is your men's ministry, the way you develop and train men, and your deacon ministry. Because your deacon ministry is not going to exceed your men's ministry. You won't have good men to become deacons if you're not training them. This is the one thing. So I'm going to digress a little bit here, but it's connected to deacons. You need to make sure in your church that you are preaching to and growing and developing men. It shocks me when I travel around the country and preach in churches that sometimes you go in a church and you think you've stumbled into the ladies' bathroom. It's pink and blue, powder blue and mauve everywhere, and there are flowers everywhere, and they've got potpourri sachets laying around. And like, tell me what man wants to come to a place like that? So when we built our building, and this was no new strategy on our part, but since we're building a building, we were very clear. Here was my one instruction to the architect: build it masculine. Build it masculine. I want timber and stone and a fireplace. I want it to feel like a Cabela's. And it does. I'm telling you, you walk in our lobby and all this exposed timber and stonework and the hearth and the fireplace. All you need is a big moose head right there on the wall, and it feels like a Cabela's. You laugh at it, but I'm just saying, you just look around Buck Run on Sunday and you'll see as many men as you do women. And that is not the case in the vast majority of churches. You usually see a lot more women than you do men. And there aren't many women, I don't know, we probably got as many men who come without their wives as wives who come without their husbands. We have quite a few more female widows than widowers, but there'd be a few more women than men at Buck Run, but not many. And I'm not making this up. These guys can attest. So when we have deacon election in the fall, we just print up a list with all of a ballot with all eligible male names on it. I'm going to talk about why we elect only men in a moment, but it's a big, list of hundreds of men that are members of our church, members in good standing, members more than 1 year, who have not removed themselves from consideration. And we tell people they can vote for this year, they could vote for 13, I think. And I could take the top 60 vote getters. And out of those 60, 58 of them would be great deacons. Now, I just don't know another church our size where that could be the case. I've been there 15 years, and not once has the church elected any man to serve as deacon that down deep inside, in my most private thoughts, I thought was unworthy of the office. Everyone they've elected has been great deacons. And they're just team players. They're wise. They're great counselors. I told you earlier about that response that time when the one member wanted to come around me and try and get them to make a decision over me. Their response is, never again will we let anybody do this. And secondly, no. I didn't prompt them to do that whatsoever. That was their response. You don't get that overnight. You have to develop men. And you do that, first of all, by you being a man of God and by you putting the burden on men. Now, my digression of a digression here is just a little bit of an excursus about my view of why women cannot be deacons. Now, I'm going to ask you to turn to 1 Timothy 3. We won't look at the Acts passage, but clearly when the need comes up in the book of Acts, when they choose deacons, they only elect men. Now, that does not preclude or forbid a woman from serving based on the Acts passage in Acts 6. We get to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and there comes a question. So, if you look at 1 Timothy 3, when Paul is talking to Timothy about deacons, in verse 8, let's just look at it, and I'm going to try and accurately represent the case that women can be deacons, and then I'll disagree with it. But it says here, verse 8, deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. Let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Now in verse 11, the ESV translates it, their wives likewise must be, and then it gives the qualifications for the wives. Now that is not a literal translation in the sense that in Greek, that literally says the women likewise. The women in the same way must be. And it's debatable whether or not that means the women of the deacons, that is their wives, or just women in general. Those that believe in women deacons argue that women deacons are acceptable based on several things. First of all, this is not a position of teaching or authority. It's a position of service. So women would not be precluded from it because it doesn't violate the scriptural principle of of male headship in the home and in the church, because these aren't leaders, and therefore women would be acceptable. Then they argue linguistically, because that says the women, the gunai plural, that can mean not necessarily the wives, but the women, just women in general. Now, that is linguistically possible. But I don't agree with that interpretation because it's just not at all unusual, not only in Greek, but really in most languages, that you can refer to you like I know we've got maybe some Spanish speakers in here, Spanish and Portuguese, both. You could introduce your wife as your woman. It does not sound crass. In English, it sounds crass, doesn't it? So you sound like a troglodyte if you say, "This is my woman." Well, that's debatable whether or not she's your wife. You call her your woman. Not so in English. I mean, in Spanish, Portuguese, not in Greek, and you don't even have to use the possessive. You just say, "There's, this. Here's the deacons and the women." You can translate that the deacons and their wives. So it would be acceptable in Greek either way to use the possessive or not, and to use women is the word for wife in a context where you have the husband also mentioned. You wouldn't use women for wife uh, without mentioning the husbands, but if the husbands are mentioned, and here's the men and the women, it's the husbands and their wives. It's just what it does. So I think the normal reading of this, the most natural reading of this, is the deacons and their wives, because it does not say the deacons, masculine, and the deaconesses, feminine, nor does it say the male deacons and the women deacons. It says the deacons and likewise the women. So I just think the most natural reading of that in Greek is the deacons and their wives. It makes no sense that you'd have separate qualifications for the female deacons than you would the male deacons. I mean, they both would have the same grid put on them, but verse 11 seems to be talking about a separate group, and it's the wives. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, sober-minded, faithful in all things. Now look at verse 12. He goes back to the word deacon. So deacons, women, deacons. Just in the flow of it, it just doesn't seem to me to be deacons, deaconesses, deacons. Deacons, wives, and deacons. And though this is not a position of authority or teaching, it is a position of influence. And I just think that the natural reading indicates that it is male, that the deacons are male. What if a church says, okay, we're totally complementarian. We don't think women should be pastors. And we wouldn't appoint women deacons to serve the needs of men. We want to have women deacons to serve the needs of women. Is that wrong? Well, I'm not going to say it's wrong. I am going to say I think it's extra biblical, which doesn't mean it's inherently wrong. But here's the problem with it, is that, again, in just the historical context of being a Southern Baptist, that is the name of this seminary. We are Southern Baptists for the most part here. All of us on the faculty are. That we have had such a problem with the whole egalitarian complementarian debate in general that, frankly, I just like to project male leadership, because I think we've got enough of a social problem that I like to be countercultural. I'm not trying to look like the culture. I'm trying to not look like the culture. And if you come to Buck Run, it's noticeable. I mean, we have women greeters alongside men, but our ushers are all male. Our platform leaders are all male. I don't think it's wrong to have a woman leading worship, in music, but I don't do it. I don't think it's wrong, but I don't do it because I want to project male leadership. We have an awful lot of single moms who come to our church. Their children don't have a dad at home that they look up to. So we put some of our brawniest guys in children's ministry. Come see Max Good. Max works for a concrete company, built like a tree trunk, and he works in our children's ministry. You should see the way those kids are just drawn to men, especially strong, manly, godly men. And so I like to project that, and I'm very consciously not trying to look like the culture. So there are things that I think are not wrong. I'm just not doing them because I'm trying to be countercultural. So if a church calls you, I'm going to assume that all of you are complementarian when it comes to the pastorate and the home. If a church were to call you and say, okay, we have women deacons, would I advise you to just automatically cross them off the list because of that? I would not. I would say, okay, you need to ask more questions. What do your women deacons do? What do your deacons do? Because in Southern Baptist churches, there's been a bigger problem that we've misunderstood the role of deacons. So if deacons aren't doing what deacons are designed to do, and that is serving, they often morph into what I told you I had at Ashland Avenue when I went there, a super committee, sort of a church council. Often it's the deacons who have the authority in the church more than the pastor because, as I mentioned earlier in another session, pastors come and go so quickly. So even if you mean well and you have women deacons to serve the needs of women, I'm just telling you there's always another Pharaoh who knows not Joseph. And 3 pastors down the road, the deacon fellowship is probably going to look very different than it does when you started out that way. And the women that are on that deacon fellowship will probably have exactly the same function and same duties as the men, and there'll be no distinction. So even if a complementarian tries to do this well and do it right and have women minister to women, I think, especially if you're going the way Baptists have always ordained our deacons, if you ordain them, I think what you're projecting to your congregation is dangerous at best. You could be very, very careful and explain to them why you ordained women as deacons and not as pastors. But I still think you're eroding the complementarian boundaries that we believe and have long practiced. So Baptists in general, it's been the moderate to liberal Baptists that have ordained women. Only in recent years have conservatives started doing it based on an interpretation of 1 Timothy 3 that interprets that as women deacons, not wives. But I'm just like, honestly, have generations of Baptists before us not done this? I mean, you can point to a few examples in history, very few, very rare, widespread, not widespread and never really caught on. So Baptists have not done this. And I certainly lean to, I believe in a male diaconate. And you say, well, what about who ministers to the women? Well, the deacons' wives do. And this is why I think there are qualifications for the deacons' wives. And we use our deacons' wives. A few years ago, I can remember a woman in our church posted on her Facebook about how much she loved the book 50 Shades of Grey. Now, that's certainly not the typical woman at Buck Run. But my church is just like your church. I got sinners in it. In fact, every one of our members is a sinner. And am I shocked when somebody does something dumb or like that? No, I'm not. Now, do I want to go sit in a room and talk to a woman about her view of 50 Shades of Grey? I do not. So, guess who did it? Our deacons' wives did it. And that's because they meet these spiritual qualifications. We talk to our deacons when they're elected about their wives being on board, and when we ordain them, we express that. We talk about their role, and we have marvelous deacons' wives who have tremendous influence in our church. So, as much as I believe in male leadership, I do not believe in male domination and value strong women, want their input, their service, but we're clearly projecting something that is countercultural, and that is male leadership in the home and in the church.